Filippo Picinini, welcome to the Pacey Performance Podcast. Firstly, I hope I haven't butchered your name. Secondly, thank you for giving up some time to have a little chat around late stage rehab.
Rob, thank you very much for inviting me. Such a huge pleasure, and that my surname is absolutely correct. So thanks for that. But yeah, no, thanks for the invitation. I'm looking forward to spend the next hour time together, and let's crack on.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate that. It's the thing that I fear the most. Genuinely, the thing that I fear the most in the podcast is pronouncing people's surnames incorrectly. So I'm glad I got the. I didn't quite put my Italian accent on, but I didn't. I did
It
all
was
right. I'm
perfect.
happy with my performance. Happy with my performance. So, Filippo, before we get into the late stage rehab side of things, would you mind just giving us a brief 1 or 2 minute bio of who you are?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, obviously, my name is Filippo Picinini. I'm the currently employed as the head of late stage rehabilitation and sports science with Isokinetic Medical Group, London. Isokinetic is a sport medicine and orthopedic rehabilitation group. So it's an Italian company. So we have around 7 clinics in Italy, only one in London, and we're going to open a new one in Athens. So we generally do provide return to sport services to a wide variety of people, ranging from professional athletes to non-professional population. So yeah, our job is just to help people going back to the same activity where they got injured, the same sport, generally. And so yeah, I've worked with Isokinetic for the past 5 years. I'm currently also in a process of completing a PhD with St Mary University in London, and I'm sure we're going probably to talk about some of this topic today. But PhD is currently related on management and late stage rehabilitation approaches after long-term injuries. I'm pretty passionate about ACL and hamstring injuries in football players. So yeah, at the moment I'm based in London. I did uni back in the days in Italy, and so yeah, currently I'm employed with Isokinetic, but specifically I cover the late stage rehabilitation. So my job is to help people returning back to sport, specifically bridging the gap between the physiotherapy-based rehabilitation that we usually see in the gym and the phase where the player is generally returning to the team back in training.
Well, it's a good job that your passion is ACLs and hamstrings. It just happens that is part of the discussion today. So just a coincidence that marries up. So when it comes to kind of bridging that gap between what goes on in the gym and transitions onto the field and then transitions back into training, you've done some work recently breaking that on-field rehab into stages. Would you mind just giving us a bit of a breakdown of what that looks like, and then we'll probably take each stage by stage and dive into a bit of detail on each one and flesh that out.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, so on rehabilitation is what we generally describe as a service, but at the same time, it can be a fantastic environment. For example, where the footballer is nicely progressed generally, or generally the athlete is generally progressed toward team training. So on-field rehab in our rehabilitation approach represent the very last stage. So it's the stage where we help our players to get the confidence back, to restore workload, to help them to go through certain specific technical, but also tactical drills. The idea is, as you said correctly, is to try to bridge as much as we can any difference we generally see between the gym-based environment and the team training environment. So on rehabilitation is generally composed in our method by 5 different stages. So Matthew Bactor, which is my PhD supervisor, did actually a fantastic job in publishing a couple of papers on rehabilitation, and so he generally explained our progression in isokinetic. We generally start from stage one. So the stage one is that stage where we push the player through what we call linear movement. So we generally have quite a lot of pre-planned activities. Nothing is reactive or unplanned in nature. So the idea is you want to try to help the player in restoring confidence, but also familiarize with the same environments where he generally got injured in. So it's the activities on the pitch generally are maintained very basic. So we try to separate what we call conditioning specific drills, like running type of drills, to very simple, basic technical drills. So the important thing in this stage is to try to avoid too much mix between the activity that you generally try to deliver and perform with a player. So for example, the main three groups of activities we generally run are obviously technical drills at the beginning, different type of like conditioning drills, but at the same time, it's an important stage where we try to bridge any difference in what we call movement quality. So especially, for example, after ACL injuries, it's pretty normal to see that the player, they're not extremely comfortable in performing certain type of movements, especially cutting. So stage one is a fantastic opportunity to help the player to gradually transition from the indoor to the outdoor environment and helping him or her to perform different type of drills, especially like cutting or different type of movements, just simply in a different environment. So we don't want anything reactive. We want to make sure the player is nicely familiarizing with this new environment. Stage two, progressively the player is going into the.
I'm just going to interrupt. Sorry, Filippo.
Sure.
Just going back to stage one, and even prior to that.
Okay.
How do we know, or what do you do to ensure that you know that an athlete is ready to progress to that on-field rehab stage and bridging that gap from the gym? Is anything objective or subjective that you use to make sure you've got that right?
Yeah, in terms of the criteria we generally look at in transitioning the play, right? Okay. So generally, I would say criteria are obviously extremely important. They're like some boxes that we need to tick, obviously, before the player is progressing to the pitch. So just to summarize them in three important groups, we ensure obviously player they have restored sufficient amount of strength. Strength is obviously important because it's linked to movement quality, it's linked to fatigue tolerance, etc. So analytical and functional strength for us is pretty important in our patients. We don't want generally to progress any patients with an excessive amount of difference in terms of deficit in strength between limbs if it's like a lower limb injury. So obviously we test that in different ways with the isokinetic machine and functional strength. But the important thing is strength is an important pillar to target before progressing the patients out on the pitch. We generally also promote the ability of the player or the patient to run properly on treadmill. We do recommend generally some running mechanics assessment, but there's some studies, there's some research about that. But the important thing is we generally want a normalized running mechanic before the player or the patient is transitioning back on the pitch, because likely once transition on the football pitch, the activities that the player is going to complete, they're just going to increase in terms of intensity and complexity. So it's likely to see some compensation strategies that the neuromuscular system can put in place if the player is exposed to too much advanced activities and not practiced before. So the ability to run on treadmill for us is a very important criteria. And also at the same time is confirming that the player has been sufficiently exposed to a certain amount of load before transitioning to the on-field rehabilitation stage. A very peculiar part of the rehabilitation that we have in isokinetic is an environment that's called grey room. It's basically a movement analysis room where we generally retrain movements. So the last important criteria and component of our process is optimizing movement quality. So we make sure that the player can move sufficiently well into like pre-planned type of activities before progressing on the pitch again. So we generally retrain, for example, deceleration, acceleration, and cutting. So basic movements that in a separate way the player likely is going to perform once transition on the football pitch. But at the same time, we ensure that the player is developing sufficient quality into these movements. It's important because likely once the player is exposed to reactive type of activities on the football pitch, the cognitive aspect of the movements, obviously the player is simply more focused on the technical task or the tactical elements rather than the producing the right movement. So automatizations of the movements for us is an important aspect of the process, but at the same time is important criteria before transitioning the player out. So we have a movement analysis system where we generally score 6 different movements with the idea to develop sufficient quality. So the goal is sufficient automatizations of what we call sport types movements. So these basic movements that we evaluate, obviously, to ensure that obviously the player can tolerate a certain amount of workload on the pitch, but at the same time to ensure that the player is sufficiently exposed to workload before transitioning on the pitch. Yeah, just to summarize them, I would say strength is an important component. It goes quite a lot along movement quality. So with sufficient movement, with sufficient strength, obviously player presents and shows sufficient movement quality, and a minimal amount of those in terms of running exposure on a treadmill with normalized running mechanics.
You mentioned the 6 qualities that you'd look at in that movement analysis room. What do they?
Yeah.
Can you explain what those are, Filippo?
So we generally have what we call these 6 sport type movements. So they are a single leg squat, drop jump, deceleration, a lateral shuffle with a lateral stop, a 90-degree change of direction, and a single leg up. So in our experience, we generally like to think that if the player is exposed to all of these 6 movements and he can handle all of these 6 movements with a sufficient quality from, for example, like a lower limb point of view, pelvic point of view, and trunk point of view, these movements, which are for us the foundations, are sufficiently automatized in order to progress the player out on the pitch. But at the same time, we know, for example, that trunk leaning or pelvic instability, they can likely lead, for example, to lower limb instability. So this is the reason why our limb stability in long-term injuries is not the only component that we generally checked. Okay, we call them criteria again. So we ensure sufficient limb stability, but at the same time we ensure sufficient pelvic stability and control and trunk stability. This is because we don't want any what we say the movement impairments when the player is progressed and assessed via this basic task. But at the same time, we check player's ability to absorb sufficient amount of work via the lower limb. So the shock absorption, what we call this, is the last important component. So I generally work with quite a lot of players, and interesting to see that most of the time when you ask them to perform, for example, like a deceleration in that room, they generally perform very stiff and rigid deceleration because in their head, obviously, they need to perform on the football pitch rather than maintain movement quality during the task. And we use this system to try to understand also how well the player is moving and how much awareness I would say they have in their body to control very basic movements. And I can tell you, I've seen quite a lot of football players scoring really bad in that test. It's mainly because you push them into what we think are very basic and simple movements, but at the same time, this is going to challenge their neuromuscular system to a point they cannot control their body properly into automatized movements. And this is something that we generally see is completely amplified, especially after long-term injuries like ACL injuries. So once we score the test, so we try to objectify the movement quality of our players. If we are happy enough with the score, and especially if the player was able to perform all of these movements with a certain amount of intensity and speed, then the doctor generally, which is the case manager after like a conversation with myself and my colleague, we are generally happy to progress the player out on the pitch. This is also proving that the player, as we said, can tolerate a certain amount of movements and a certain amount of workload before starting going on a football pitch. There's not like a general, I would say, guidelines or a gold standard in progressing players out on the football pitch. But talking with some colleagues in football clubs, for example, they generally do not spend too much time retraining movements and working on movements. They generally transition the player out on the pitch for inline running, etc. But most of the time, when I talk to players, they will probably they will tell you that they're not actually very confident in cutting or stopping. So this is something I like to think, okay, I want to retrain this earlier because I want to make sure the player is in a positions where he can stop, he can accelerate, and he can cut properly once on the pitch. So this is why we generally spend time in these environments to retrain these qualities before transitioning the player out on the football pitch.
Amazing. Right. I interrupted then, Filippo. We've gone forward to go back again. Let's accelerate forward. to stage 2, what does that look like?
So stage 2 generally is, so first of all, we generally progress players or patients, athletes to stage 2 when they prove they have sufficient quality in terms of movements from inline movements, pre-planned movements, but at the same time, if they're able to complete a certain amount of workload. Okay, so players generally in our clinics during the Onfield rehab process, they are monitored with GPS technology. So obviously, we're able to quantify the amount of workload they experience on the football pitch. So it's not all about the psychological readiness of the player to transitions from inline to multi-directional movements, which is generally characterized stage 2, but it's also the ability of the player to tolerate progressive workload, progressive increments in workload, because it's important that the criteria generally we use to transition the player, they are not just, I would say, externally related, so related to the psychological and the confidence of the player to perform certain drills and certain exercise on the football pitch, but it's also how the internal physical response says. So, for example, is the knee reacting? Is the knee swelling? Or is the muscle coping with certain activities that we're doing? Likely, once the player is not sufficiently prepared to be on the football pitch, you might see knee joints swelling, you might see restrictions, progressive restriction in range of motion, and generally you might see also the player physically struggling, right, to progress stage to stage. So stage 1 to stage 2, generally we move from inline movements to multi-directional drills. This is also a stage where we progress at the same time as technical drills. So it's a stage where I like to introduce basic technical drills with the player. Obviously, players love the moments where you introduce the ball on the pitch for the first time. So this is something that you can hold them back too long because otherwise they're not compliant anymore with the process. So we generally perform multi-directional movements such as cutting and change of direction. But as I said, for the stage 1, they generally happen in separate drills compared to technical drills. So it's important to maintain the sessions and the drills that we generally deliver to the player highly controlled. We don't want mixed drills too much because otherwise this is going to add complexity in the type of activities that we're going to perform on the football pitch. And the last important component, obviously, we want to see from a GPS point of view a nice and progressive increment in workload toward stage 3.
So just going back to probably ask the same question again, is there anything objective in terms of using sports tech, using technology to identify that you're confident to go from stage 2 to stage 3? And well, I'm probably going to ask that every single time, but that's fine. Is there anything that you use specifically here that guides you to understand that that athlete is or patient is ready to progress?
So generally, we check obviously from a GPS perspective, we check different type of metrics. So this is the stage where we said stage 2, we add multi-directional type drills. So likely cutting, deceleration, acceleration. So from a GPS point of view, I like to see, for example, the amount of workload the player is completing around these metrics. So acceleration, deceleration. I like to see that this workload is going to increase. But at the same time, I'm checking the knee response or the muscle response from the type of drills I'm delivering to the football pitch. So for instance, I like 12 and 24 hours post sessions monitoring with my players. So we generally check the again like knee range of motion, the pain that they can potentially experience in the knee, or any like adverse reaction that ideally we don't want to see. In terms of like load progression, is I think more related to the tissue, like the soft tissue capacity to tolerate increased workload. So usually novel type of loads. So for example, like a new, like a change of directions, or the load generally that the player is experiencing in a new movement they have never performed before at that intensity is obviously generating a certain amount of stress in the body. And likely the main structure they're going to react, they are like the soft tissues, so like the muscles. If I generally see, for example, that the player is not recovering sufficiently enough session to sessions because, for example, the load was too much, or for example, the drills were like too complex, and he put in place some like compensatory strategies. Generally, I like to manage load a bit differently. So I'm not probably going to increase the workload too much, and I'll probably hold the player a bit longer into that stage before transitioning it, for example, to stage 3 or to a different stage. So it's important not just the external response in terms of the GPS metric, the amount of workload that we expect the player is completing for certain amount of GPS metric, but it's also important the internal response. So is the player coping with that load? Is going to, familiarize with the movements? Is going to perform the movements in the right way? Is the quality of the movements good? It's not always just about the workload, because likely we can push the player through quite a lot of workload and then they recover, but most of the time is not going to be enough. So like a proper planning, I think is going to be very important. But for me, the internal response is key in order to progress the player to stage 1 or 2 to stage 2 to 3, etc.
With that said, Filippo, do you have any kind of general targets for accelerations or decelerations or total distance, high speed running? What kind of GPS metrics are you looking at, and do you have any loose guidance to say, okay, we've hit that number, we've hit that number, we've hit that number, the internal response is X, we're happy to move?
So generally, again, from experience, I see, for example, that players they do have the capacity to tolerate quite a lot of workload at the beginning, especially because the workload is very small. So likely, for example, from stage 1 to 2, we're going to see quite a lot of big increments in load. So for instance, one of the projects in the PhD I'm working on is a database on more than 100 football players who recover from ACL injury, and they were all aiming to resume 11-a-side competitive football. So the interesting thing was that the average workload, for example, the total distance, the moderate speed running, and the amount of acceleration and deceleration performed between stage 1 and 2 did actually increase by 60%, which means obviously that the player he was able to tolerate quite a lot of workload compared to what we thought. But again, the closer the player was going toward the end of the process, obviously the smaller were the amount of workload they were able to see between stages and weeks, for example. So if you want me to give some number, for instance, that player in stage 1, they usually do cover between 3 to 4.5K per session in terms of like total distance covered. Speed wise, generally we don't exceed 20 kilometers per hour, so like 5.5 meters per second. This because it's going to place a different type of stress on the musculoskeletal system of the player. So we generally try to keep everything around 15 to 20 kilometers per hour, so like 4.5 toward 5 kilometers per hour in terms of peak speed. And we help the player to build what I would say more volume. So that is the priority, I think. So you want at the beginning to avoid to push the player into too much intensity in terms of high intensity acceleration, decelerations, and speed. But we generally try to prioritize what we call more like the volume metric, so the total distance, the moderate speed running, and try to basically create like a foundation, like a baseline for the player where you can accumulate more. So these I think are the main metric. They don't obviously cover any high speed running in stage 1. This because it's just the entry stage, it's the very beginning. But then generally towards stage 2, you likely see some players probably more confident or better prepared to progress toward the on-field rehab. Then likely they can hit some high speed running. Generally, I like in stage 2 what I call like microdosing of a high speed running. So we try to go with a very tiny exposure in some sessions of the week just to have a bit of stimulation for example, for the hamstrings, in alternation maybe to some extra gym-based exercise they're doing. So I like the on-field rehab environment also as an opportunity to stimulate certain muscle groups via different type of activities that the player are doing. So for instance, when you expose the player for the first time after an ACL injuries to some high-speed running, likely the player he will start to experience a bit of like fatigue in the muscle toward the end of a session, and likely the same evening or the day after, he will respond you from the scale or the questionnaire that you sent to the player that actually the hamstring is sore. But this is good because actually we were able to localize quite a lot of work for the hamstrings via that type of activity. So when I explain to my students the on-field rehab is at the beginning is just like a group of exercise that you combine all together and you create one session. And then you have the external response from the GPS. By the end of the day, it's important to design the right exercise to see the exact outcome from a GPS point of view.
Let's dive into phase 3. What does that look like?
Stage three, I think, is very interesting because stage three is basically the first time that the football player, or generally, let's talk about football players. Football players usually are exposed to what we call obviously technical drills or football specific elements. So this is the stage where all the foundations football related, so like for example passing, turning, stopping the ball in different way is done because usually it's completed in stage two. Stage three, you gradually start to contextualize the technical drill a bit more. It's a stage where from a technical drill point of view, you're trying to keep everything very planned. Okay, we don't want any reactions again applied to football situation. This because alongside football technical drills, we generally add a bit more reactivity into movements. So as we said again, this is a stage where we have two important elements. We have the multi-directional type of activity, so like cutting, acceleration, deceleration. They are gradually increasing in terms of intensity and complexity, but they are also progress from pre-planned to reactive. But at the same time, we also have in the same sessions more technical element. So longer passing, dribbling with the ball and playing. So like different, very, very basic components. But at this stage, which is very, very important, we are not mixing together reactive drills with technical football stuff. This is going to happen usually in stage four. And obviously, if we observe stage three from a workload point of view, stage three again is that stage where we want to see from a GPS data point of view a nice increment in load. Okay, this is the stage where likely we see the player hitting a bit more peak intensity, for example, in acceleration, deceleration. This is another important metric that we generally check. So, which is the highest acceleration and deceleration they were able to perform on the football pitch. You will likely see the peak speed increasing session after session. And I like stage three also to as a stage where I'm trying to build a bit more volume around high speed running for the player. This is going to be in preparation of sprinting. Generally, this stage is also a stage where you might see the player kind of like sprinting for the first time. So they generally achieve very, very good speed, likely professional football player because they generally approach the on-field rehabilitation very, very prepared. So once you get up to stage three, you might see them able to hit some sprints maybe for maybe one sessions a week. Again, I generally manage and modulate the drills quite a lot because I want to maybe achieve like different variable, different aspects of the GPS. But it's still a stage where I think the physical preparation of the player is still a bit more important compared to the technical and tactical components. So stage four probably, as we're going to discuss in a second, is the stage where actually the player is brought into his own position, his role as a football player, and is where we generally run what we call position-specific football drills, reactive drills, etc.
Just in terms of that, and in terms of that introduction of the ball, which I know you highlighted, you know more than any how important that is psychologically for a footballer to introduce the ball, and taking me back to my playing days, and I know how that important that is as well. Is there any techniques or little tactics that you've implemented along the way to introduce the ball way earlier, but just to almost for the sake of it, but just so they can see it and feel it and touch it with the foot or whatever it is? Do you find that you can do that and do that from
Absolutely.
a psychological perspective more than anything?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a very good point, to be fair, because especially when you have players still, as we said before in our process, our players generally they tend to complete quite a lot of sessions indoor because we retrain movements, we expose them to plyometric drills, we just do generally quite a lot of activities. So technically, the time that they spend indoor is quite a lot. So obviously, I need to keep them entertained at one point during the session, and probably the ball is the best element to do that. So yeah, generally, I like actually to reintroduce very simple technical drills, even indoor. So especially when the player knows that we are about to transitions on the football pitch, maybe in like 1 or 2 weeks times, they like the idea of like trying some technical drills before we go on the pitch. Luckily, they are a bit rusty. They don't feel really like confident with the ball. So it's something that just to smooth the process more, I like to introduce indoor, and generally I progress that outside. But the idea, obviously, to introducing the ball is it plays an important psychological component and element in the process because players, I think running is an important bit of the process. It's a very important milestone. But at the same time, footballers play football, so you need to introduce the ball at one point in the process. And when they see and feel, they can kind of like the touch is still there after the injury, especially after long ACL injury. They don't touch the ball for like 4, 5, 6 months sometimes. It's nice to see them, that they're happy. They know like, okay, I can still play football. And even as a practitioner in my head, honestly, it doesn't make any sense because I know that the process is still very, very long. For them, you actually give a massive boost in confidence. They also just obviously project them straight to the pitch. So yeah, definitely I'll introduce basic, simple drills. Sometimes, combined to, balance components, etc. I just invent different drills just to, sometimes distract the player to the monotony of the session. If we're retraining movements, you spend a lot of time correcting, changing things, etc. So they like the kind of like the fun component in the session. So I think this is an important aspect to consider with football players.
I think now might be a good time to ask this question. And there's been a lot of debate, especially on social media, about how much we take in terms of a technical model for sprinting from sprinters and how appropriate is that? Like, should we be taking the principles but adjusting them to fit our team sport athletes because team sport athletes don't run like sprinters? Do you have a particular technical model that you're working towards when it comes to the running mechanics side of things? I know we're moving on to kind of running retraining and the kind of reactive side of things, but when it comes to the model of how someone should look when they run, I know that's we can't do that for everyone because everyone moves differently, but do you have a technical model that you work to when it comes to running mechanics and trying to shift people to something?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, over the years, I try obviously to try keep myself as much as I could interested, obviously, to running. Running is a very huge element, is important component because it's basically the beginning for towards sprinting, high speed running and sprinting. So I like, for example, quite a lot the Exos model of running and sprinting, and I generally use also the Altis kilogram method for qualitative assessment. So I tried honestly to pick a bit from different schools of thoughts, just not the same book, not the same courses. I'm a very open-minded, so I like also conversation, for example, with uh, speed coaches from rugby. For instance, if I think they're like fantastic, honestly, in retraining speed. I had a few conversations with very, very good practitioners from NFL. So I try to pick generally from other sports sometimes when it comes to speed retraining, for example, in footballers. And so yeah, Altis I think is fantastic in his progression, but also Exos they generally have very very solid frameworks and progressions for speed. I generally in terms of speed progression, as you said, I start from very very early. So I think, for example, the lumbo pelvic control plays a massive important role in speed retraining, especially from a mechanical point of view. So in a ACL process, for example, again in football play, we try to start from very very early to reintroduce these basic exercises because like most of the force that you produce during like a sprint is obviously transferred via the lumbopelvic area and the core area. So generally, we want really strong players, but at the same times, we want them extremely coordinated from a pelvic point of view. So we start very early in the process to retrain that, and then generally we progress toward more like athletic type drills when obviously players are ready to do certain things. I like the same principle of adding
Sorry
the.
to interrupt. Sorry to interrupt, Filippo. How, in terms of the lumbo pelvic control, how do you go about that? How do you tackle that early on, like you mentioned there?
So generally, early on in the process, let's say even like a couple of months after surgery, the idea is we try to progress the player, as we said, toward on-field rehab. So there's quite a lot of different components that we try to tackle. One of them for me is lumbopelvic control. It's not just because you want a nice lumbopelvic coordinations for sprinting, but also because the lumbopelvic control played a massive role also in multi-directional drills. Likely, if the player is not capable to control the knee after an ACL injury, it's not because it's coming from the knee, but it's coming from the pelvic area. So when I talk about lumbopelvic control, obviously I would like to spend the whole afternoon talking about that because it's a very big topic. But for me, it's about the hip flexors and hip extensors muscles and the coordination that you need to achieve into these muscles, not excluding adductor abductors. These are the four more important muscle groups that gives you a nice lumbopelvic control in conjunction with your deep core and lumbopelvic area. So we generally start early in the process. When I talk with my colleagues, for example, physios in the gym, we generally try to save a little bit of time in each session to start to retrain the pelvic area and the lumbopelvic control from simple, for example, ground exercises like dead back walk and simple like march on the ground. This is just to reactivate the core area, try to develop lumbopelvic awareness and basic foundation in order to develop that into more like athletic drills. This is usually done indoor. I think this is actually another important thing to mention. I think, especially in players recovering from long-term injuries like ACL, you don't want to wait for the on-field rehabilitation to try to correct the running technique. This is because likely the player will put in place quite a lot of different compensation. So we want to make sure that this lumbopelvic control and this running mechanics retrainings generally happen in the indoor environment and then is progressed outdoor. This is, I think, very, very key. Is just to avoid a like classic compensatory pattern that the players can put in place, because you need to consider that most of the time they just don't have the confidence to do certain movements, and sometimes the on-field rehab is not the right environment to retrain certain movements like running or sprinting, for example, if you don't have like a nice foundation. So I think lumbopelvic control is just one single element, but then we can talk about, for example, intramuscular coordination. So there's so many components that we generally consider in the running retraining process. But the main link, I think, between upper body and lower body is obviously the lumbopelvic area, and this is why I mentioned that, and I think it's going to be a really important key aspect to consider in the process.
Perfect. Sorry for interrupting there, Filippo.
No worries.
Just moving on to stage 4. What does stage 4 look like? Again, I'll probably ask the same question, so I'll ask it up front. What kind of metrics are we looking for to hit? Is there any exit criteria come on the back of stage 4 to progress into stage 5? What does that look like?
So stage 4, I think, personally talking, I think is one of the most important one. But at the same time, is that stage where the player for the first time is going to perform specific football technical drills and tactical drills in a reactive and non-pre-planned way. So I think it's a kind of exciting stage, because you, as a practitioner, you're going to see all the job coming together, because this is the first time where the player is actually challenged into position-specific football drills, for example, so related to his own role and positions, but at the same time with reactive components. So this is the stage where we for the first time we ensure that the player is really coping with certain football-specific drills. Okay, so I like, for example, in this stage to sometimes record very simple, like just a camera with some video. I like to record the player performing certain drills, because as we monitor and assess movement quality into pre-planned drills in the previous stages, I like to do the same thing when we add the reacting component. And I can tell you it's extremely fascinating, because unfortunately we have some research telling us that some players are exhibiting some like injury specific mechanism, even if they're not injured, or actually some of them when they're transitioning from pre-planned to non-pre-planned. So I think the movement quality control is actually not stopping in stage 3, but is actually carry on, especially in stage 4, because stage 4 is you have the reactive element, and this is extremely key because is adding also context, is acting much more reality to the movements and the exercise that the player is performing. So from a let's say from a qualitative point of view, this is the stage where the idea is you want to replicate the same movements, the same passages of training and generally games that the player is should sustain back at the club. we're not aiming to do this with the same amount of workload, but it's the first time that player actually is performing that type of movements. And usually, if I have, for example, other players on the football pitch, all of them, recovering from like similar injuries or they're like roughly the similar level, I like actually to put them together so they do like basic group training, group drills, and this is adding finally a bit of context, which is going to replicate what they have back at the team. But as we said before, stage four is still not the stage where we're aiming also to see the same pre-injury value in terms of workload. It's a stage where the player is probably around 70-80% of pre-injury workload values on the main GPS metric. This because, as we said, is the first time that you're finally putting together the technical, tactical components and the movement component from a reactive point of view. So if you're going also to add excessive amount of workload, is going to be enough. It's going to be too much, obviously, for the player to handle. So we generally keep players around, I would say, 60, I think, probably towards 70% of pre-injury chronic workloads. And the aim is we give them this type of exposure in the view of progressing them to stage five. Stage five is what we call basically the training simulation phase.
Carry on, Filippo. On a roll. Carry on to stage 5.
Stage five is very interesting. It's mainly for two reasons. You generally, as a practitioner, I'm a practitioner, obviously. There's an important difference to the job sometimes you might see in sports scientists or fitness coaches from football club. I generally see football players coming from all around the world, so they generally come from different clubs. So likely, I'm not in a situations where I can straight transition them back into the same team because I don't have the same team in terms of availability. So stage five is that stage where it can happen back at the club because technically it's modified team training. But at the same times, if you are clinically based, in my situation, I should be able to try to create like a very similar team training situations. But at the same time, all the session that we performs are very workload focused. So this is the stage where hopefully the player should have complete already some reactive drills, sport types, movements, sport specific movements, position specific drills. But this is the time to replicate the same amount of team training demand. So this is the stage where we want to try to smooth as much as we can the workload experience that the player is having. Is this because if we're not preparing the player physically enough to sustain a certain amount of workload, the following stage is the player transitioning back to the team, and likely we're going to experience a spike in load. Okay, so it's extremely classic to see football players with very tiny hamstring injuries, for example, resuming training back at the club. This because likely they haven't had enough preparation before. Okay, so stage five for me, the main priority is contextualizing drills as much as we can in terms of like a football drill situation, but at the same times we need to make sure that we're not missing the workload component. This is very important because the goal is to try to prepare ideally the player physically for the same amount of workload they can potentially experience in team training. But at the same time, as a practitioner, it's going to be extremely hard because I don't have the player in a team situation. Most of the time, maybe I've got other players recovering from like similar injuries or at the same stage, so I can create drills where we obviously push the player to max intensity, we push the player to pre-injury values, but I need to be able also to create that context component that most of the time is missed when they have one-to-one sessions or they train maybe with 2 to 3 players. But the idea for me is I don't want to recreate the same team training environments. I'm just trying to create a similar experience for the player from a psychological and workload point of view that they can likely is going to be magnified back at the club. Generally, this is the stage where physically we can push the player toward the limit. And actually, we like to think that we want to try to slightly over prepare the player physically in order to smooth the process once back at the club, especially from a physical point of view. This because we need to consider that the player back at the club is going to experience more cognitive, more physical load anyway. So we can tackle the physical component because we can just train the player more. But sometimes it's difficult, as we said, to recreate the cognitive element. So this is the stage where we push the player to the limit generally. We need to test if physically the player can handle the same pre-injury workload. So this is for me the most important components. And also we try to target a little the cognitive component. So we try to add to the football drills some cognitive element, but also some context. So for example, some drills where the player are working with two, three, four other players if I have the opportunity. Or generally, this is the situations where when I have players like local players coming, for example, from local clubs in London, it's a stage where they maybe come to us, they come to me for a few sessions during the week just to top up in terms of workload, but at the same time they are transitioning back to the team and they may be completing the other 50% of the session back at the club. So at this stage, honestly, there's not like a general rule. You have quite a lot of different situations. Generally, in a normal football club, you might see the player gradually transitioning into modified team training with the team. In my situation, I might have the player 50% for the week with me, so they maybe do like 2 to 3 sessions just to top up from a workload point of view, but while they're doing some light sessions back at the club. And this is just planned accordingly with the performance team at the club in order to smoothen the process. But on the other side, there's some players, for example, they complete stage 5 back at the club. So they usually finish with some reactive and sport types, position specific drills in stage 4. We advise the club, for example, they have achieved a certain amount of workload compared to pre-injury values, but at least they are aware that if they want the player transitioning back in stage 4, there's obviously a bit more physical preparation that need to be done for that player.
Amazing. Just picking up on you said psychological experience. I think that was a really interesting one. I think that is appropriate for people in your situation that are external from the football club, but also those people who are in the football club, because injured athletes will feel not pushed to the side, but separate from the rest of the group because they are. So how do you, especially in that later stage, but maybe as you go through as well, create that psychological experience of transitioning into team training to get them psychologically ready as well as physically ready?
So I think this is a very good point and also very important because I think the psychological component plays a massive role in, especially in long-term injuries like ACL or Achilles raptor injuries. This because the player has been away from the team for quite a lot of time, and this is the situations where I think you generally see the personality of the player. I work with quite a lot of players; they are extremely confident, psychologically to go back to the team. They actually can't wait anymore to be in the team. But on the other side, I work also with a lot of players. Interestingly, they don't feel comfortable around some drills maybe that we do on the pitch. So even if they have completed the physical preparations, but we do maybe some psychological evaluation, and we noted that the player actually is not that psychologically ready. We generally try to hold the player back a little, not because he's not ready to go back to the club, but because we explain the player that I want also him psychologically ready to go back. And generally, I found interesting that when I can prove, especially from a number point of view with some GPS data, that the player is physically ready to go back to football, they actually get quite a lot of confidence. So maybe they're not extremely, psychologically ready to be tackled or to do certain type of cutting and passing, or there's some what we call worst case scenarios. So there's some situation where they not feel comfortable around. But I like to so first of all, I like to create like some situations where the player it feels comfortable to train in terms of, for example, putting the player in pairs to some players at the same level or coming, for example, from similar injuries. This is actually a very good strategy because they build a relationship and they kind of like help each other to progress toward the end. But on the other side, we actually help the player in from let's say more like like a psychologically point of view again, but it's more when the player is on his own, for example, on the pitch, because this is another situation I have. It's not always situations where I've got other football players they can train together and then likely they push each other. There's some situations where the player is on his own, is doing like one-to-one session, is maybe even like a pro footballer, so he's missing the context, he's missing the psychological readiness. So these are a more tricky situation because, again, from a GPS point of view, you can ensure that the player is physically ready. But I can tell you that you don't want a player not psychologically ready to go back to football after an ACL injury. Because unfortunately, I've seen also player re-injured just because the psychological component. So they're not confident to tackle, they're not confident, to get involved in the situation and the game. So for those players, for example, I try to find some, like, let's call them like anchors during the process. There might be a certain movements they are not able to do, and we replicate the movements many, many times during the session, and then I gradually add a bit more context to the movements just to convince the player they're able to do it. Or, to be fair, in some situation, I have to get involved in the session because this is the only way to help the player to become familiar again, especially around context. So I spend, in stage 5, for example, I spend quite a lot of time doing like drills, including contact with the player. Obviously, they are highly controlled, but at the same time, at least the player is experiencing the content again. And I can tell he's boosting his confidence amazingly. So for, if you want me to give you like some suggestion to practitioners out there, I think is going to be very important to link as much as you can with the player, because if the player is confident in the process, is compliant, and he trusts you in terms of practitioner, also you're more able to convince him on certain barriers they can potentially develop during the late stage. So for example, not psychologically ready to tackle or not psychologically ready to contact, etc. So I think the relationship with the player is the foundation, and then as a practitioner, we have like different ways, to develop this the psychological readiness to the player. But if the player is not engaged, is not involved in the process, and you ask the player, for example, to do certain drills replicating the same way you got injured, there's no chance that he's going to do the drill. He's actually holding himself back, and then you see from the GPS data that he's holding himself back. So the foundation, I think, is the relationship with the player. And I like sometimes when I get involved in the session. So I physically train with them sometimes, not the whole session, but obviously I do certain drills just to help and convince them they are able to do certain things. And from experience, I know that is something extremely useful to support also psychologically the player to transition back to football.
What's your first touch like, Filippo?
It's still good,
Is it good?
but the it's still good. It needs a lot of practice though. I haven't played football in ages, but it's still there. It's still
Good
there.
man. It's still there. It's still there. That's all that you need. That's all you need. Well, thank you so much for that. Like, incredible amounts of information there, which I'm sure listeners will gain so much from, especially, like I said, and obviously the whole point of this conversation in that late stage on-field rehab situations for long-term rehabs. So, Filippo, anyone that wants to get in touch with you, social media, the research that you've done, the research that you're doing, where's the best place?
So I'm on LinkedIn, so you can find me as a Filippo Picinini on LinkedIn. I've got my Instagram profile as well, where sometimes I publish some tiny insights from my job. Is Filippo Picinini Rehab, and yeah, I'll be more than happy to leave my contacts if anyone can reach via email or LinkedIn. I'll be happy to reply to any questions or curiosity. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, I'm going to let you go. Thank you for the last hour and 5-10 minutes. Really appreciate it, and look forward to staying in touch and look forward to publishing a article on Sportsmith from you as well.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Rob, for today.